Hello, my name is Hilary Burgess and I want to talk to you today about epistemology and ontology. These can be very difficult terms to understand when you're setting out to do your research project, and I'm hoping that this talk with the illustrated slides will help you to understand a little bit about these two terms. This slideshow is about epistemology and ontology. I hope that it will help you to understand these terms and what they mean. They both relate to what we call methodology, which is about a whole set of debates around fundamental questions relating to research. It can be seen sometimes as a very dry subject, and therefore very abstract to read about. But what I'm hoping is that through this particular slideshow, I can help you to understand ways to think about it that will enable you to use them in your research.
This presentation is about epistemology and ontology. The aim is to explain what these terms mean and to introduce you to some of the underpinning debates relating to doctoral research.
I have divided this talk into two parts. The first part is about understanding the differences in the epistemological starting points of qualitative and quantitative research. And these are core issues involved in research design. And then I also want us to think about the links between philosophical debates and research practice.
The presentation focuses upon understanding the differences in the epistemological starting points of qualitative and quantitative research, the core issues involved in research design, and the links between philosophical debates and research practice.
First of all, we need to consider what is methodology, and why do you need to think about it as a research degree student? Nearly all students are expected to write an extensive methodology chapter, and sometimes when I read theses, I feel that students have just written a methodology to try and get it out of the way, get it done with and over with fast. But in actual fact, you need to be thinking about your methodology not as a hoop to be jumped through, but as something that needs to be considered throughout your research as a whole. And
First, though, we need to explore what methodology is. This can be seen as rather a dry subject, and the terms of epistemology, positivism, and phenomenology as rather daunting, especially when what you want to do as a doctoral student is just get on with your research. However, as a doctoral student, you will be expected to write an extensive methodology, and so thinking of it as just a hoop to jump through is very problematic. It would be a huge mistake to try and develop your methodological rationale as an afterthought. Really good methodology chapters and good pieces of research integrate thinking about methodological issues into the whole thesis, and particularly the analysis. In order to do this, you need to develop a knowledge of the different methodological debates.
Now, really good methodology chapters are those which can properly integrate thinking about methodological concerns into their analysis. So I'm hoping that through looking at the debates around epistemology and ontology, that we can think what the implications of these are for your research right from the beginning. So first of all, what's the derivation of the word epistemology? What does it mean? Well, if we look at some of the foundations of it, episteme means knowledge, or how can we know what we think? So epistemology is about considering the question, what constitutes valid knowledge and how can we obtain it? And it highlights the fundamental questions which have implications for how our research should proceed.
So what does epistemology mean? One definition is that it is about what constitutes valid knowledge and how we can obtain it. The derivation of the word is from Greek, episteme meaning knowledge and logi meaning mind. This can be explained as how we can know what we think. So epistemology highlights fundamental questions that have implications for how research should proceed.
There are many competing epistemological positions, but there are two that stand at the extremes from one another. And one is positivism and the other is phenomenology. Now, if we consider these two positions, you then get a sense of the range of perspectives that are on offer. And it might be first of all to begin to think about what we mean by positivism. And a useful way to think about this is to think of the positivist researcher as the scientist and the phenomenological researcher as the detective. Now, the positivist researcher holds that social scientists should model all their activities as far as possible on the natural scientists, such as physicists and chemists. That's not to say they should exactly use their techniques, but there is a distinct set of methods required. So positivists argue that social research should aim to concern itself with facts and not.
So what are the different competing epistemological positions that you need to get to grips with? In my explanation, I'm going to take two extremes at either end of the epistemological continuum. The first is positivism, and as this picture indicates, positivism can be thought of as the scientific approach.
So the other key competing epistemological position is phenomenology. And this is about seeing research as in the role of detective, someone who's trying to find out what is happening through exploration.
At the other end of the continuum is the phenomenologist, who could be described as the detective.
So let's think first of all about the researcher as scientist. As I've already said, the researcher as scientist seem to agree that research should aim to concern itself with facts and not with values. And its positivism maintains a clear distinction between these two things. Values are thought to be subjective evaluations of the world, containing moral dimensions, with terms such as good, bad, right, wrong, and so forth, and are typically used to express these. And facts, by contrast, are seen to be value-free, so that by definition they are not subjectively distorted or biased.
So what do the positivists argue? What is their position? Positivists argue that research should aim to concern itself with facts, not values. Values are thought to provide subjective evaluations of the world and have moral dimensions, so that terms such as good, bad, right, wrong might be used to express this view or values. Facts, on the other hand, are thought to be value-free and are therefore not biased and not open to being subjectively distorted. For a fact to be a fact, it needs to be verified through experiments or observation. So in order for a positivist to answer the question, what constitutes knowledge and how can we obtain it, things need to be objective and testable.
So what is the position of the researcher as scientist, or the positivist epistemological approach to research? So positivism is about theory testing. It's about trying to minimise influence of the individual researcher. Positivists look for standardised ways of measuring and quantifying the social world, and their aim is to isolate specific measurable variables and explore the relationship between these.
Positivism, therefore, is a theory-testing position that strives to create objective knowledge and minimise the influence an individual might have on their research findings. Positivists look for standardised ways of measuring and quantifying the world, and generally use quantitative methods that allow a researcher to count or quantify evidence. They aim to isolate specific measurable variables and explore the relationship between these.
So now let's look at the other end of the continuum, the epistemological continuum, and consider phenomenology, the researcher as the detective. Phenomenology grows out of a wide-ranging critique of positivism, and it sets about to challenge the idea that research should be based on the natural sciences. And the implications of this difference go beyond determining just which methods can be used by researchers. For phenomenologists, this difference has implications for what actually counts as knowledge and how we can obtain it. Phenomenologists suggest that the positive quest for objective knowledge is a fundamentally flawed one. They suggest that inasmuch as a researcher has chosen a specific area as worthy of researching, that person has made a value judgment. For phenomenologists, the positivist distinction between facts and values is a fallacy. So that rather than striving for completely objective knowledge, phenomenologists suggest that instead we recognise that all knowledge is value-laden, and that we should seek to identify and declare such values, think about their significance, and perhaps even use them as an integral part of the research.
But what about the phenomenologist, the researcher as detective? Phenomenology grew out of a critique of positivism. Phenomenologists challenge the idea that research should be based on the natural sciences. They argue that the positivist quest for objective knowledge is a fundamentally flawed one, and that just deciding what to research is a value judgment.
So phenomenologists argue that all knowledge is value-laden, and that rather than striving for completely objective knowledge, we should try to identify and declare values, rethink about their significance, and use them as an integral part of the research. They say that it's not simply possible to replicate an experiment or a set of observation on human beings in the same way as we might replicate a natural scientific experiment. And that's because human beings are unlikely to behave in exactly the same way. Part of the reason for this is that human beings interpret and engage with the world they live in. They're not simply driven by external forces. So the key interpretative characteristic of our subject matter as social researchers has implications for the kind of knowledge we should be pursuing. So if you think again about that central epistemological question from right at the beginning, what constitutes valid knowledge and how can we obtain it? Phenomenology holds that the most valid kind of knowledge is subjective knowledge, and that we come to know things by viewing the world through the
Phenomenologists argue that all knowledge is value-laden, and we should seek to identify and declare such values, reflect on them, and perhaps make them an integral part of the research. They suggest it is not possible to replicate an experiment or a set of observations on human beings in the same way you can replicate a scientific experiment. This is because human beings are unlikely to behave in the same way in any given situation. People engage with the world they live in and form interpretation based on their experiences. So phenomenologists hold that the most valid knowledge is subjective knowledge, and that we come to know things by viewing the world through the eyes of the people we study. Phenomenologists, therefore, look for flexible research approaches that draw on qualitative methods. They are not so interested in measuring the world, but rather in interpretations, meanings, and experiences.
There are two readings with this talk, and I want you to take a little time out now to just read both of them and see what you think. They're about the same research topic being studied, reward and commitment, but one is an example of a researcher taking a positivist approach, and another is an example of a researcher using a phenomenologist approach. Can you identify the differences?
You should pause the presentation now and read the two short examples on worker commitment. However, note that these interpretations are greatly simplified for the purposes of this explanation. In thinking about the example of the positivist researcher, you might also want to ask, could these three organisations have been unique cases? Might respondents not have answered honestly? What might have compelled respondents to answer in ways not indicative of how they really felt? These are all valid questions, and questions to which a good methodology chapter would attend. It's through exploring such questions that you might also indicate directions for future research. However, in a modest way, the researcher in this example might be able to claim that they'd made some contribution to our understanding of commitment. In the other working example of phenomenology, you might well have other further questions. You might be tempted to ask, can't phenomenological researchers read just about anything into their findings? They have, after all, so much data to work with. And this is indeed a key dilemma for phenomenologists. The first thing to note is that it is also possible to present and analyse statistical data in a number of ways so as to support a particular theory or idea. That's to say, facts do not speak for themselves. Researchers have a tremendous amount of scope to interpret their findings and present them to their audience in ways which support their preconceived hypotheses. So the same criticism could be made of positivism. However, this question does, nevertheless, raise concerns over the extent to which it's possible and accurate to say something about the bigger picture on the basis of a qualitative study.
The next two slides just set out in a table what might be considered to be the advantages of taking a positivist or a phenomenological approach, and then the following slide, the disadvantages of both of these approaches.
This slide explains the advantages of both positivism and phenomenology. Take a few moments to look at each of the two lists. This slide sets out the disadvantages of positivism and phenomenology. Again, take a few moments to look at what these disadvantages are.
So in terms of thinking about your own position, in terms of epistemology, you need to ask yourself a number of questions. What kind of knowledge do you want to generate? Are you going to be theory building or theory testing? How much depth do you need to go into? What sort of approach best suits your research problem? What response rate are you expecting? And also, will you be able to produce enough data, but not too much, upon which to base your thesis?
So when you are thinking about your epistemological position for your research project, you need to ask yourself the following questions. What kind of knowledge do you want to generate? Are you theory building or theory testing? How much depth do you need to go into? What best suits your research problem? What sort of response rate are you expecting? And will you be able to produce enough data, but not too much, upon which to base your thesis?
Another way to think about the positive and phenomenological approaches or conceptualizations of epistemology is to also think about them in terms of the quantitative and qualitative divide, or deductive and inductive research approaches. This is a distinction, though, that begins to collapse sometimes in practice, especially if the research draws upon a combination of methods, so that the research uses some qualitative as well as some quantitative components, some theory building as well as some theory testing aspects. It looks as though this could be a case of where the middle ground between two extremes is the safest, but this isn't as straightforward as simply combining everything and working with an eclectic mix of methods. Such an approach could potentially be flawed, as the premises of different research strategies and methods are based upon sometimes conflicting or even reconcilable issues. Epistemological debates are not just how different perspectives on what counts as valid knowledge and how we can obtain it have implications for the methods we can use. They also indicate that how we use methods have implications for the kind of knowledge we can generate. So simply combining two techniques from different ends of the methodological continuum creates its own distinct set of problems. So how can we combine these very different sets of data? And how can you resolve very different epistemological positions that these techniques are predicated upon? Researchers could, for example, select respondents for interview on a random basis, so that there might be some scope for statistical generalisation, depending, of course, on the depth and number of the interviews. And in analysing qualitative data, it might sometimes be possible to code responses and count simple answers or frequencies. To formulate more positive is how many types statements. So at the practical level, it seems perfectly possible. But at the more substantive analytical and conceptual level, the issue is harder to resolve. The phenomenologist researcher will immediately ask the question of what might get lost in the process of coding and counting. Might it be precisely that which the researcher should be concerned with? What are the nuanced meanings and interpretations of a particular respondent? At the opposite end, the positivist might be wary of generalising from interviews conducted within a phenomenological frame. So, for example, questions asked the same way to all respondents in the interviews. These might not create different responses from these interviews and reflect less the individual differences between the interviewees and more the differences in how the interviewers ask the questions. So there are no easy answers. But what you do need to try to do is to consider how you're going to attempt to resolve these problems, how you can show your awareness that these are indeed problems, and these particularly in view of the underpinning epistemological debates. One of the ways in which this has been considered is through using a process called triangulation. This is usually about the use of different methods, characteristically 3, that are set to look at the same problem from 3 different angles. The idea is that through cross-checking of findings from these different methods,
So is it possible to combine techniques and approaches from different ends of the methodological continuum? In practice, a great deal of research draws upon a combination of methods, using both quantitative and qualitative approaches. However, doing this is not straightforward or simple, as the premises different research strategies and methods are based upon are sometimes in conflict with one another. This is because how we use methods has implications for the knowledge that we generate. So how can you resolve the different epistemological positions? One way to do this is to show awareness of the underpinning methodological and epistemological debates, and to try to resolve matters in a way that successfully synthesizes both the positivist and the phenomenological approaches. Those who read your thesis will be interested in how you attempt to resolve these problems in view of the underpinning epistemological debates. One approach that has been developed to help solve this problem is triangulation. Triangulation involves the use of disparate methods, usually 3. For example, a quantitative survey, participant observation, and interviews to look at the same problem from 3 different angles. The cross-checking across these different methods helps you to see any distortion caused by any one individual method. Through reflection, you can check, resolve, and possibly eliminate differences caused by your selection of methods. You can also match your findings across the different methods.
At the end of the last session, I left you pondering on triangulation and how useful it can be in terms of carrying out your research. I think one of the key points to remember that as a doctoral researcher, the main thing is not to ignore methodological debate, but to realise that your awareness of these will make for more sophisticated research, more significant findings, and a much better informed thesis. In this next session, I'm going to focus specifically upon ontology and questions of ontology.
The next part of this presentation focuses upon ontology.
So as we discussed in part 1, the philosophy of social science is based upon what constitutes valid and worthwhile knowledge, epistemology. And this focus has led to a polarisation of research paradigms between positivism and relativism, of which phenomenology is just one variant. And the distance between these two positions has a significant impact upon the conduct of research. Both research paradigms are a mass or ensemble of rules, practices, habits and customs, and to those who are new to research, Historically, the focus in the philosophy of social science is upon what constitutes valid and worthwhile knowledge, epistemology. And this focus has led to a polarisation of research paradigms between positivism and relativism, of which phenomenology is a variant. And the distance between these two epistemological positions can have a significant impact upon the conduct of your research. Both research paradigms are a mass or ensemble of rules, practices, habits and customs. And to those who are new to research, becoming sufficiently familiar to approach research confidently can present seemingly insurmountable problems. Now, this whole polarisation of research methods rests upon a focus of epistemology, is, however, questioned by some. And realism, in particular, questions the all-embracing focus upon epistemological issues that both positivism and relativism seem to adopt. Now, in contrast, realism, rather than being informed by debates concerning what constitutes valid knowledge, is primarily informed by ontological questions, and that one particular ontological question: what exists in social reality? So, to put it simply, the switch is from a focus upon knowledge to a focus upon what exists, and that represents a switch from epistemology to ontology. So realism argues that knowledge about the world has already been created. So in setting out to do our research, you need to ask, what is the world like? What is the context for the research that for my research? If you fail to ask this question, that has an impact upon both a positivist or a relativist approach.
So what is ontology? The derivative of this word is also from Greek, meaning the nature of being, existence or reality. Asking what exists in social reality is an ontological question. The switch is from epistemology, which is a focus upon knowledge, to ontology, with a focus upon what exists. A focus only upon epistemological issues means that ontological issues become secondary or oversimplified. Realism, therefore, argues that knowledge about the world has already been created, and so you need to ask, what is the world like? If you fail to ask this question, then there is an impact upon both positivism and relativism.
So what is it that the realists claim? Well, first of all, they argue that a focus on epistemological issues means that ontological issues are in fact simplified. They argue that both the positivist and the relativist positions or assumptions are flawed, and that ontology is unavoidable because our actions are based around a view of what the world is like, whether we initially have thought about that before or not. So in conducting any sort of research in which the aim is to produce knowledge, we assume we can measure or interpret our chosen object, and that the data will actually mean something. So realist ontology assumes that the world exists independent of our knowledge of it, and that there is a difference between the way we view the world and as it actually exists. So if you take the example of sexual discrimination in the workplace, you might respond, if you were asked that question, that there was no sexual discrimination in the place or area that you worked. However, just because you don't know about it is different to what might actually be happening. And if you were to ask another person about sexual discrimination in the workplace, they might have evidence. So what does realism claim? Well, first of all, they argue that a focus on epistemological issues means ontological issues become simplified. They also argue that the positivist and the relativist assumptions are flawed. They suggest that ontology is unavoidable because our actions are based around a view of what the world is like. So conducting any sort of research in which the aim is to produce knowledge, we assume we can measure or interpret our chosen objects and the data will mean something.
So what does realism claim? Realism claims that because the epistemological positions of positivism and relativism focus upon knowledge rather than the object of knowledge, they necessarily make flawed ontological assumptions. Explained another way, ontology is unavoidable because no matter what we do, our actions are based around a certain view of what the world is like. Thus, in conducting any sort of research in which the aim is to produce knowledge, we are assuming that we can measure or interpret our chosen objects, and that the data we collect and present actually means something. These are ontological assumptions. Realists argue that if you focus upon which type of knowledge is most valuable, this automatically makes a number of important assumptions about what the world is really like in the first place. So, for example, in the case of positivism, this manifests itself in a simplistic ontology, in which the world can be known empirically, but is unable to include phenomena that cannot be measured. On the other hand, for relativism, choosing between rival explanations of the same phenomena can be problematic, given the lack of external, objective measure.
So a realist ontology, therefore, assumes the world exists independent of our knowledge of it, and that there is a difference between the way we view the world and as it actually exists. Take, for example, the issue of sexual discrimination in the workplace. If you were to work in an area and were asked that question about sexual discrimination, you might respond, no, there was none in the area that you worked in, simply because you hadn't observed it, you hadn't experienced it. However, not knowing about it is different to what might be happening, and a different person asked the same question might respond very differently. So, the way we view the world and how we think it is might very well be different from what actually exists.
A realist ontology, therefore, assumes that the world exists independent of our knowledge of it. This means that there is a difference between the way we view the world and as it actually exists. An example of this might be an investigation of sexual discrimination in the workplace. Respondents asked about sexual discrimination in their workplace may reply that it does not exist. However, a researcher who analyses interview applications, successful and unsuccessful applicants, promotions to senior posts, and levels of pay, may well uncover levels of discrimination that exist at the institutional level, of which respondents are unaware or simply have not considered. Such an argument could be well applied to the subject of chemistry, where since the mid-1980s, male-female students on undergraduate courses have been roughly 50-50, and this dips only slightly to 60-40 undertaking postgraduate PhD courses. Despite this, fewer female chemistry lecturers are successfully appointed to university departments, and out of those, a tiny proportion, less than 10%, achieve the status of professor compared to their male counterparts.
So how can realism help you as a researcher? Realism does provide a valuable critique of the positivist and relativist research paradigms. It can help you to explore the underlying structures, the observed as well as the unobservable. And it aims to reveal structure, powers, capacities, and their mode of operation in whatever topic you might be researching.
So how does realism help researchers? It can provide a valuable critique of the positivist and relativist research paradigms and explores the underlying structures of the observed as well as the unobservable. It also aims to reveal structures, powers, capacities, and their mode of operation. The ontology of realism, therefore, reflects upon the complexity of social life. The theory of ontology can be thought of as being layered, consisting of the deep, the actual, and the empirical domains that, whilst being fused together, may be temporally distinct.
So you need to ask yourself a number of questions, especially when you're trying to think about where does your research fit and what are the implications for your research design. First of all, where do you think you fit on the methodological continuum? Do you lean more towards the positivist or towards the phenomenologist? What epistemological assumptions
So where does your research fit, and what are the implications for your research design? First of all, perhaps you need to decide where you fit on the methodological continuum. Are you more of a positivist or a relativist, such as a phenomenologist? Does this lead you towards more quantitative or qualitative research methods, or a combination of both? What epistemological assumptions does this lead you to make? And what ontological questions should you ask? What exists in the reality of your research?
Having listened to this presentation, you should now follow up by trying to read about the various issues, the various positions in terms of phenomenology or positivism, the realist perspective, what is meant by triangulation, and so on. And most importantly of it all, if you have questions, you should discuss these with your supervisor.
In making this presentation, I would like to acknowledge that I have drawn on material from the Doctorate in Social Science, Module 1, Unit 2.